Hi, this is Tim at Huntington Learning Center in Irvine. And one of the questions I get asked the most is how to improve on the STAR reading test. So I made this video to introduce parents to the types of questions that are on the test and also to give you some tips on what can be done to improve the score. You probably already know that the STAR reading test is a computer-based adaptive test that is used to determine reading levels of students. In the Irvine Unified District, it is used as one of the criteria for both the GATE program and the A+ program. So of course, a lot of parents are concerned about doing well on this test. There are many different types of questions on the test, but they can be grouped into three rough categories. Word knowledge and skill is basically vocabulary, but it can cover everything from basic definitions up to the connotations of words, understanding idioms, expressions, synonyms, antonyms, and breaking up words into smaller parts to determine the meaning. Comprehension strategies and constructing meaning would cover basic comprehension questions of the text up to higher order thinking questions such as fact and opinion or cause and effect, comparing and contrasting elements of the story. Finally, there are analyzing short literary text, and this goes beyond the story and more into the mechanics of what makes a story, some of the elements, the themes of stories, the author's intention and point of view. So these are some questions that are generally done as discussion in class and are not often seen as multiple choice questions in the classroom. Parents of younger students, if they're taking the test maybe for the first time, are concerned that their child is not familiar enough with computer-based tests to do well. There's several different ways that you can answer questions. You can do it with a mouse. You can answer a question by, like if I wanted to choose bluefish here, I could press number 1 and enter on the keyboard. Or if I'm using a touch screen or an iPad, I can just click on the answer in order to choose it. If the student gets 3 questions right in a row, then the test will go on to the actual test. This is just the practice. But within the beginning questions, it goes up to 5 questions. If the student is having trouble, then the proctor of the test will be notified so that the student will get some help in order to do the test. And then only after the teacher has checked on that to make sure that everything's okay and the student's getting some help, then the test will move forward into the actual test. If everything is fine, then this little pop-up message will come up on the screen telling me that I did a great job and the actual test will begin. The start of the test will be made up primarily of vocabulary questions. Keep in mind that this is an adaptive test and there is a history based on performance of your student in the past. So the level of the questions is going to be based on that history, and it does not start at 0 every time the student takes the test. The vocabulary questions are often going to be of this type where you've got a sentence with a blank and the student has to choose the word that fits best on that blank. The focus on these questions, as is vocabulary in all Common Core, on context. So looking at the sentence and determining the meaning of the word that you need or the meaning of the word based on other words in the sentence. So in this case, Ellie's many talents make her a very blank performer. We know that she has many talents, so which word in the list of words there matches the idea of many talents, and the only one is really versatile. Although some of the other ones might fit grammatically, they don't fit the context of the sentence. The questions, of course, are going to get progressively more difficult. This is the same kind of sentence, although it's a little bit longer, a little bit more involved. So you have to look at it and determine that we know that there's some kind of talking going on. So what can you do while you're talking? I'm doing it right now as I make this video. My hands are moving. It's something we normally do. So you would go with the one that is something that you would do while you're talking, which would be gesticulating. So you want to keep reading the sentence carefully, looking at those clues within the sentence. One common mistake I see is that students think they know the meaning and they quickly choose an answer without looking at all the different choices. So make sure you read through all of the choices and don't just click the first answer that you think it is. They do give you, even though there's a time limit, they do give you quite a bit of time. So take your time, choose the right one. There's no hurry to get the test done quickly. So what can a student do to improve their vocabulary so that they can do better on the STAR reading test? One of the first things they can do or not do is get behind in vocabulary. This is a graph of what's called the 4th grade slump. And even though it's called the fourth grade slump, the issue actually begins around third grade, where a lot more academic vocabulary is introduced into grade 3 curriculum. And also the reading content gets a lot more complex. So as a parent, you can make sure that from kindergarten up to third grade, your student is reading, they're getting introduced to appropriate vocabulary or even vocabulary above the level of the student's reading ability. Students can, because of their living in the world, they can understand words that are being spoken to them, even if they can't read them. So if you want to read to your child, you can always read a year or two above the actual grade level of the child, and they should be able to understand. It will always introduce new vocabulary to them, which will give them an edge once they're able to actually sound out those words. So keep introducing your child to new vocabulary, higher level vocabulary. Don't dumb down your conversations around them. Make sure that they're constantly getting input of new vocabulary. You can also actively improve vocabulary in a number of ways. As I just said, you can always engage in their daily learning of new words. Yeah, of course, you can memorize words. That's always an option. But you also want to make sure that those words are getting used around the child, that they're reading books that have those words in them. If I were to introduce a new word today, and that is the only word, the only time they hear that word and it doesn't come up in the next year, it's not very likely that they're going to remember it. So they have to read a lot, they have to hear those words used a lot, and they have to use those words. They also have to be aware that words might have multiple meanings. A word like table has a very different meaning in a kitchen than it does in a math book, or a crane on a construction site versus next to a pond. So make sure that the child knows what these words mean and what they might mean within different genres or different styles of writing. Like the vocabulary questions, the reading questions are also going to be based on a history that student has built up over different star reading tests that they've taken. So again, it's not going to start from zero with very basic questions, but it will start with easier questions within the range of that student's ability. The questions that they will encounter, it's important that they understand the story, but they also have to know the terms and vocabulary that are used in the questions. In this example, even if I understood every word in the story, if I didn't know what it meant to make a conclusion, or if I didn't know how to make a conclusion, then I would have difficulty with this question. This question might fall more under the vocabulary category where you're trying to determine the meaning of a particular phrase. Sometimes you're trying to understand what it means. You might understand why the author used that phrase. There's different questions that might be asked about an underlying phrase, but you have to understand the vocabulary, you have to understand the context, and you need to know any particular vocabulary that's used in the question itself. Here's another example where you're looking at understanding the meaning of the underlying phrase, but not just the meaning, but what that phrase does to contribute to the argument of the passage there. So there might actually be multiple things going on within a single question. Here's another example of a question where the student might read the passage and understand all of the words in the passage and then get to the question and not know what an analogy is. And not knowing what an analogy is or how it works, they're not able to answer the question. Some of the questions that I believe are the most challenging for students are the ones that deal with the author. Why does an author include a detail such as this? Or what is the author's point of view? Because these are questions that are not often covered in assignments in the classroom. They might be done via discussion, or it might be in the form of conversations, but not usually in this multiple choice question type. So it's coming up more and more in Common Core curriculum, but a lot of the kids are not trained to do this. So these are questions that you want to be aware of when you go into the test, and that it would be a good idea to practice maybe with your child while they're reading. If they're reading a story, you can ask them questions about what happened in the story, but also why do you think the author did this, or what does he mean by that? Here's another author question, this time looking for the author's point. In some ways, it's like finding the main idea of the passage, but in this case, it's focusing on looking at the vocabulary used by the author or the tone that the author has used in order to understand what the point of the author's passage is. Questions might also be phrased differently. This one says, which of the following is true of the argument made by the author in the passage? You might also have phrased this question as, what conclusion can you draw from the passage? So there's different ways of phrasing questions that really mean the same thing. And the more experience you have with these questions, the better you're prepared you are to answer the question because you understand what they're looking for. Here's another example of a question that has a couple of things going on. First of all, there's an analogy, and you have to know what an analogy is. And then you have to determine whether or not that analogy is effective in the author's message. Maybe it is, or maybe it isn't, but you have to understand both of those things and understand the question in order to answer this question effectively. Sometimes the student is asked to read a passage and then determine whether or not the author provided the best evidence or the best argument. So in this case, you read through it, and why is the author's response to potential objections inadequate? You have to understand what's lacking. So this is almost more of a writing skill than it is a reading comprehension skill. Does your child know what needs to be included in the text in order to make it a more effective argument? In this example, you're supposed to read the passage and determine whether or not the method that the author used to resolve the conflict that was in the story. Again, you have to understand story elements. What is a conflict? What is resolution? Whether or not the author did a good job of that. And in a way, you're critiquing the writing based on the options that they give you here. So you have to understand whether or not the author did a good job. This is similar to the earlier question about whether or not the author did a good job of supporting the argument that he or she was making. Here's just another example of understanding why the author did something. The author has defined semi and demi-permanent colors because the whole point of this passage is looking for a semi-permanent or a hair coloring option that's going to wash out. So that is the purpose of defining what these two options were. So you have to understand the main idea of the passage, and that should show you why the author chose to explain these different vocabulary words for the reader. I've mentioned a couple of times that vocabulary is really important for doing well on this test. Understanding story elements is one. In this question, it's more of literary devices. You read this passage and it says, what technique is often used in fiction to help readers better understand the need for uniform time zones? And you look at the answer choice and you've got illusion, imagery, and character. So if you don't understand what those literary devices are, then you're not going to be able to choose the right answer. So make sure that your child knows the story elements, make sure they know literary devices, make sure they know the types of common questions that appear on the test so that they can understand the vocabulary that's going to be used. This is just another example of a story element, understanding what a plot is. I probably didn't have to put all of these in here, but I wanted to give you as many examples of the questions as I could. You can see that they come up fairly frequently. Here's another question that determines whether or not, or that causes the student to determine whether or not a passage was written with the best supporting evidence. But you've also got the challenge of some vocabulary here. What does credibility mean? If the student doesn't understand what that is and cannot find the reason for that, then this is a challenging question. This is the first passage we've had that actually talks about genre. This passage, you read the passage, you have to decide what element of the passage is kind of typical of a crime or detective fiction. You might have the same type of question about science fiction or fantasy or drama. So in addition to all the other vocabulary that a student should know, they also need to know about the different genres of writing and the elements of those different genres. This is another question that can be misleading, like which generalization could also be phrased as what conclusion can be drawn from the passage. Here's the first vocabulary question we have that involves looking at the parts of a word and trying to understand it. Previously, I didn't mention the idea of memorizing roots and prefixes. That is something that is also good for helping you to understand vocabulary. In this case, they give you the information and it's just a matter of putting it together. But when you come to vocabulary that you don't know, if you have a good background in the roots and prefixes, the Greek and the Latin of English, then that can help you understand word meanings. I'll go through these last couple of slides a little bit faster, but here's another example. You can see where understanding the vocabulary, what is an assertion, what is objective versus subjective, what is the easiest way to verify the assertion. So you have to understand the passage, you have to understand all the vocabulary that's being used. Reading the questions carefully is important. This is an example of one that might be confused for the student having to understand what the meaning of a particular phrase means, when in fact what they want to know is basically the style of writing that's being used, kind of like, was it first person, or is it the author's opinion, is it the opinion of the character in the story? And understanding that is what's required to answer this question. And after going through all of those questions, we finally come to one that is a basic detail question. So there's not a whole lot of thought that goes into this one, but it is one where you have to look through the passage to find the answer to the question. So what can a student do to improve their STAR reading score? One of the first things you can do is familiarize yourself with the types of questions on the test. If you don't know the phrasing behind questions like drawing conclusions or inferencing or fact and opinion, sequencing, and you haven't practiced how to answer those types of questions, then they could be not only difficult, but also time consuming, and the questions do have a time limit. In school, they do practice these a little bit, but a teacher, when they come up with their lesson plan for a story, they have so many obligations. They have to meet technology requirements. There has to be group discussion, all of these different activities. So there isn't as much straight reading and answering of questions as you might think in the classroom. So in order to get better at this, you have to do a lot of practice. When I posted this kind of video before, I've gotten comments that, this is a test that's supposed to determine the level of the student, and you really shouldn't be practicing for this kind of a test. And that might be true in a sense, but at the same time, students are being evaluated with this test. This test is being used for placement into different programs, and you really should practice. So practicing questions of this type to do better on the STAR reading test is no different than if you were in a sport like basketball and you're working on shooting and dribbling in order to do better at the game. That isn't cheating to practice those fundamentals. It is going to make you better overall, and if that makes you better on the test, then that's great for you as well. You also need to practice reading comprehension just generally. This is you reading at home, making sure that you're not playing too many games, but you're also working on reading books at home every day. One that is very specifically having to do with multiple choice tests is learning effective test taking strategies. This could be a process of elimination when you're working with multiple choice questions, managing your time, how do you deal with fill in the blank type vocabulary questions. There's techniques for all of these. And there's practicing the questions in order to find the clues that are hidden within the questions will also help you. So part of this is training, which would require someone to guide you along. The other is just practice using reading practice materials. Reading a wide variety of materials is also important. Again, if you only read fiction or you only read nonfiction, you're just constantly reading histories, then you're not going to be as effective if you come to a nonfiction science passage or a horror or a mystery passage. So the more types of literature you read, the better you're going to be able to understand them and what's going on in the passage. Thank you for bearing with me through all of that. I probably should have cut the questions down a little bit, but maybe that gives you a sense of how your kids feel when they sit through all of those questions during the STAR reading test. If you look at the comments below, you see that there is a link you can click on. If you click on that link, then you will be able to download our STAR reading tip sheet, which has a list of the types of questions that appear on the test, as well as some terms of story elements, literary devices, as well as a number of questions based on the author type questions that appear on the test that your child should be familiar with. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them here, or you can do them via our Facebook page. Thank you very much.